All right, so welcome to Chapter 11. This is a chapter we're going to get into some in-depth stuff with the nervous system. So this first section, slides 1 through 18. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. These are everything else is peripheral nervous system. The brain is the largest, most complex part of the nervous system, and it controls a lot of different things. Things come into it. It will think about them, even as it says here, and decide what needs to be done about the sensations that are coming in. It'll send things out that need to be done, and we call that movement. Now, the brain consists of two cerebral hemispheres, a little joining area called the diencephalon. The brain stem, which is basically the go-between between the spinal cord and the brain. The spinal cord is called the brain stem once it enters the cranial cavity. And then this little part behind it called the cerebellum, which literally means little brain. As I said a minute ago, brain stem is what connects the brain to the spinal cord. These central nervous system portions, the brain and spinal cord, are going to have connections to the peripheral nervous system by the peripheral nerves. So I've got we'll see a picture in a minute, I've got a brain, spinal cord, and that's the central nervous system. And then I've got things coming off of it, even up here at the brain stem, those 12 cranial nerves. Now, the central nervous system is basically walled off from every other system. There's going to be a very distinct border around it. We call them meninges. They are these membranes. The central nervous system doesn't have visceral membranes like we looked at, visceral parietal, but these things are kind of like that, but they're called meninges. They are going to protect the brain and spinal cord. They're going to have all kinds of issues or parts to them that we're going to look at here as we go on. So there are three meninges, and they go from the outermost, which is the dura mater, the middle one called the arachnoid mater, and the inner one called the pia mater. You can remember DAP, D-A-P, from the outermost going down to the innermost. So the dura mater, as we just said, is the outermost. It is a very dense, very tough connective tissue. It is very hard to get through this. Now, we're going to look at that in the cranial cavity. It is right along the side. It's attached to the periosteum in the cranial cavity. But when we look at a vertebrae, and we see where it is in here, we're going to find out that there's a space between this dura mater, this outermost, and the bone, and that is what we call the epidural space. So most people have heard of a epidural. So that is talking about this space. Epi means above or outer. Dural is referring to the dura mater. So it is the space between the bone and the dura mater in the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is this middle one. It is web-like. Again, arachnoid kind of should make you think of spiders. That's where they get it, because it's web-like. It is going to be pretty much right up against the dura mater. So I'm going to have the dura mater, this thick outer one, and then right up against it is this web-like film, basically, that we call the arachnoid mater. And then I'm going to have a space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, this inside, and we call this subarachnoid space. Right? So sub meaning below, arachnoid referring to the arachnoid mater. This is where we find cerebrospinal fluid. And then finally, the inner one is called the pia mater, and it is attached to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. It is equivalent to the visceral membrane that we talked about back in the beginning part of 210. All right, so I want you to know a little bit about these. Dura mater outermost, it is very tough. In the cranial cavity, it is attached to the periosteum, but in the spinal cord, it's going to have a space between it and the bone, and we call that the epidural space. The arachnoid mater is going to be right underneath it. It is web-like. There is a gap between the arachnoid mater and the deepest meninge called the pia mater, called the subarachnoid space. That's where cerebrospinal fluid is found. And then finally, the pia mater is going to be the meninge that is attached directly onto the central nervous system. It's basically the central nervous system skin. So these are little pictures of it. This kind of shows some of it in here. Again, we're not going to get into, there's certain areas that are going to have these spots where we can reabsorb this. You do not have to know it. For me, I just want you to know that the dura mater is directly attached to the bone. And this shows the cross section of the spinal cord. So I've got this area here. I'm kind of pointing to it. I don't know if you can see me scribbling in that little area here. That is called the epidural space. It's pretty famous because there's a pretty famous shot that has to go in there. Then we have the dura mater with its arachnoid matter right underneath it, a space which we call the subarachnoid space, and then finally right on the surface of the spinal cord is the pia mater. All right. Now, cerebrospinal fluid is produced in areas called ventricles, and we're going to look that there's 4 ventricles in the central nervous system. The ventricles are interconnected to allow the cerebrospinal fluid to flow through, and they are going to be aligned. We'll look at this in a minute. They're aligned with those epithelial cells we talked about in the last chapter. Again, they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid. There are 4. Each one of the cerebrum, each hemisphere has a ventricle, so there's 2 ventricles. We're going to see this in a picture in just a minute. So if I'm looking straight on, I'm going to have a ventricle in this one, a ventricle in this one. They're going to both come together. There will be one ventricle in the middle that they go into, and that's called the third ventricle because of there's 2 here. And then the third ventricle is going to go down, and then there's going to be this little 4th ventricle. So that's fairly easy. Hopefully you'll follow along on this. So these are the things. They look like little ram's horns almost. There's little spots inside these little ventricles. So they're called lateral ventricles, and there's 2 of them, however you want to count them. They go in and both drain into this one. This is called the third ventricle. The third ventricle then drains into the 4th ventricle. It almost sounds like some sort of a bad Sesame Street song. I just want to point out this third ventricle is what we see in our lab when we see the cross-section of the brain that we look at and describe as the diencephalon area. The diencephalon, if I'm looking at it, if I go from looking at it on this view to looking at it here, the diencephalon is going to be inside, and there are going to be little areas off to the side inside the hemisphere. Now, this I want to make sure you know. Cerebral spinal fluid is secreted by special little capillaries called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is a special group of capillaries that secrete epithelial cells, secrete cerebral spinal fluid, and they are covered by epithelial cells. Remember, we talked about the epithelial cells. They had all this cilia on the surface. And so when something is there, they wave back and forth, and it causes a current movement of that fluid. Now, there's going to be a very, very hard border to get across on this. We call it the blood-brain barrier between the circulatory system and this. So this is going to help. That's why it says there's a selective transfer of substances from the blood to the cerebrospinal fluid. I'm not worried about you knowing all the different things in here, how much is in our body at any given time, where it is reabsorbed and absorbed and back and forth. But what I do want you to know is mainly on this first part here. It is cerebrospinal fluid is secreted by the choroid plexus. It's the special capillaries of the pia mater. And there's going to be epithelial cells lining that, and they are going to be covered in cilia and cause that cerebrospinal fluid to have a current or a movement. This kind of shows a little bit of where they are. This kind of, I wish I could enlarge it a little more, but in through here, this is the choroid plexus. All along there are those epithelial cells, and they're causing this circulation of this fluid to go down and around and up and through. Again, not worried about this side or this one. Good ones to kind of know something about, but not worried about it. The brain, as we go through, the brain is the grand poobah. It is the largest portion of the central nervous system. It is where all kinds of things are. That's where our sensory input goes to, sensations and perceptions. We're going to talk about the difference between those. It's going to have the areas of motor commands. It's going to be sending out to work your skeletal muscles. Every motion that you do is going to originate from your brain. This is where your memory and reason is, and those things we refer to as higher mental functions. It is going to have all kinds of special areas that help when we decide to move something, that they are coordinated to make a smooth movement. We take for granted how complicated that is. And then way underneath everything, we have all kinds of reflexes for regulating visceral activities. Nobody in here has to consciously think about what enzymes they produced as to what carbohydrates and proteins we ate, or do I need to get my heart to beat faster or slower, and when is it time for my liver to release the bile, and blah, blah, blah. You don't understand and don't have to deal about any of that. But the brain is controlling that. And this is also where our personality is. And there are times when people have had brain injuries and they'll have complete changes in their personalities. And we'll talk about that at another time. So the brain has got 4 major portions. You should have looked at this in lab. You've got a cerebrum, which is the 2 areas, the 2 lobes, right? The cerebrum, this gray wrinkly part here. Then I'm going to have this little band of tissue that connects back and forth. This on our model is what we call the diencephalon. Right? Now the diencephalon in lab you've seen, and we're going to talk about it even in here. There's 2 portions to the diencephalon. There's an area called the thalamus, and then an area called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is always below the thalamus, right? Unless you're standing on your head, of course. And then you have the brain stem, which is from the top part here, we'll learn is the midbrain. It's going to have this area here called the pons, and then finally this bottom layer called the medulla oblongata, which is such a fun word to say. So this is the brain stem. So those are the 4 basic parts of what we consider the brain. The cerebrum, all right, the cerebrum, which we looked at and just talked about up there, the cerebrum has a couple of things. It has 2 hemispheres. All right, so if I'm looking at it here on this bottom left, I can see a left and right hemisphere. It has what we call a corpus callosum. I don't know why this doesn't have the picture of the inside, but the corpus callosum is that little band. If I was able to look at it inside of here, there's this little thing that looks almost like an upside down ear in here. And that's what connects the 2 hemispheres and allows them to talk to each other. We also have what are called gyra and sulci. Gyra are the ridges, the raised area, and the sulci are the grooves. So if I'm looking at a cross section of the brain and I see that it's got these little areas like this, gyra are the hills, so to speak, and sulci are the valleys, so to speak. Now, if a sulci is big, and it goes very deep, I should say, it is called a fissure. There are 2, longitudinal and transverse. They're named for the plane that it's on. So anyway, the longitudinal is going to separate the 2 hemispheres. It goes right along here. Right? That's the one that separates the 2 hemispheres. The transverse would be the one that separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So it'd be right through here. And since I did skip on the last slide mentioning anything about the cerebellum, this little part here in the back is the cerebellum. And if you're like me, sometimes I have a problem trying to remember the difference between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. I can always remember if I get hit in the back of the head, I get my bell rung. And so the cerebellum is the little thing in the back part of the brain. Now, the structures of the cerebrum, we're going to have lobes. I'm not worried about the insula. But we have 5 lobes, but 4 of them are very obvious. All right, so we have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, a temporal lobe, and an occipital lobe. Hopefully these are things that you know because you looked at the skeletal system. The frontal lobe, I'm going to circle it, is right here. There is a distinct little line in between here that runs right along, and we'll talk about that at another time. It's called the central sulcus. Just behind that, now I'll tell you what, instead of just behind that, I'm going to go all the way to the occipital lobe. So if I go all the way to the occipital lobe, which is fairly easy, it's going to be the very back part. And so I've got these 2 in the middle that sometimes people could think that would be hard to tell the difference. We have the parietal and the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is always going to look like this little thumb that's sticking out. And then above it is the parietal lobe. These 4 lobes are named for the bones that go over them, and 2 of them have a muscle named for the bone as well. So hopefully those are all pretty well understood. So in this, the structures of the cerebrum, we're going to look at the cerebral cortex, which is this outer layer of gray matter. Now remember, gray matter, and I say remember, I don't think I got to really talk about this. In the nervous system, especially the central nervous system, you have 2 types of things, gray matter and white matter. Now, most times you'll hear that gray matter is going to be unmyelinated axons, where white matter is myelinated axons. And that's a good rule of thumb, and definitely white matter is simply bundles and bundles of myelinated axons. But gray matter, more than just being unmyelinated, gray matter is the area of the neurons. This is the area where decision making is going to go on. And so there's going to be this thin layer along the outside of this gray matter. So I've got all kinds of white matter inside my cerebrum. This thin layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex is where most of the decision making comes. And 75% of all the neurons in my nervous system, in my body, are going to be found on this layer. And that's why concussions are a really tough thing, because a concussion is a brain bruise. Neurons do not repair real well. So if something happens like a bruise, that means that they're damaged. Right? So 75% of all neurons are found in this layer. White matter of the cerebrum, which is the most, is what lies underneath the cerebral cortex. Again, it makes up most of the cerebrum, and it is bundles of myelinated axons. It is bundles of telephone cables, basically. They are just connecting back and forth to the cell bodies of the cerebral cortex. So I've got this outer layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex. I got this majority, which is inside, basically, called the white matter, which is bundles of myelinated axons. And then in another video, we're going to talk about a few areas that are pockets of gray matter that are in this white matter. And one of them we looked at just a few slides earlier, that's called the thymus. But we'll get into that at another time. So I hope that all was clear.